Hi, I'm Jeff Kell, and this is 105 Conversations, and today we have conversation number 2 with Mr. George Shultz, former United States Secretary of State and Secretary of the Treasury. We're inside the Hoover Institution. He's a distinguished fellow with expertise in global, political, and economic policy. He's worked under Eisenhower, Nixon, and Reagan, and I'm really excited to have this conversation today. It's a pleasure. I'm excited about this interview. I've looked forward to this. To give you a little background, I'm framing this as a blueprint for future generations. It's a very positive interview, and I want to talk about all the issues and how to best frame the future for youth and my generation beyond.
Well, I have 5 children. I have 11 grandchildren, and I have 3 great-grandchildren. So, particularly the great-grandchildren, they make you think about the future. You say to yourself, what kind of a world are these kids going to have? And what can I do that could make it a little better for them? That's my preoccupation these days.
So with that in mind, what's the legacy that you're trying to leave behind, or the high points of your career thus far?
Well, right now, the things that I think about the most are governance. Our country isn't doing a good job of governance. Our economy, which needs help. The really interesting possibilities in the field of energy, if we take advantage of them well. I think we're not handling the problem of addictive drugs in a good way. I have some thoughts about the way you conduct diplomacy. And I'm very much concerned, along with others here, about nuclear weapons, because they have a consequence, if ever used, that's simply inhumane and immoral, and we need to figure out how to get rid of them. If you're conducting diplomacy, you need, I think, to make 4 rules for yourself. The first is, be realistic. Don't kid yourself. Look at the world as it is, warts and all. Plenty of problems, plenty of opportunities, but understand it clearly and describe it to yourself accurately. The second rule is, be strong. That means military capability, but not just military capability. You want military capability that's so strong that no one wants to test it. And you want to have a strong economy that you work from. But at the same time, you need to have a country that has a certain self-confidence in the ideas it stands for. Then you need to be willing to engage with other countries and be part of trying to construct a better world. Engagement doesn't mean that you just make compromises with others. You engage on the basis of your agenda. You say, what is the agenda that we think makes sense from our point of view? And that's what we take into the engagement. And then I think you need to do that in a spirit of optimism. That is, you need to feel that this agenda we're realistic, we're strong, we have a good agenda, and we can conduct ourselves in such a way that we think something good can happen. Never give up.
Going into bipartisanism, because it's a big issue today, how was conservatism understood in the Reagan administration?
In the Reagan period, let me just give a couple of little anecdotes. Tip O'Neill was the big Democrat. And somebody asked Ronald Reagan if Tip O'Neill was his adversary. He said, not after 5 o'clock. So the 2 Irishmen could get together and hoist one and cut a deal. The other is a very important tax reform, culminated in the 1986 Tax Act. It was probably the most sweeping tax reduction ever. huge numbers of preferences were swept out of the tax system and rates were lowered. The top rate was lowered to 28%. Now this was worked carefully through with scoring done by the Congressional Joint Committee on Taxation. The staff were very good staff. When it came down to it, Reagan's proposal was introduced into the House of Representatives by Dick Gebhardt, who was the Democratic leader, and to the Senate by Bill Bradley, a Democrat. It passed the Senate 97-3. And somebody asked Ronald Reagan if it bothered him that his legislation was introduced by 2 Democrats. Do you know what he said? He said it passed, didn't it? That's called governance. Today, everybody wants credit for everything. When you went into Ronald Reagan's Oval Office, there was a big sign in the front of office that said more or less, there's no limit to what a man can accomplish if he doesn't care who gets the credit. Yeah, well, right now, politics seems very polarized, and people make a point of disagreeing with each other. It seems to be the thing to do. If you're for it, I'm against it kind of attitude, which is not rational, because we're both Americans and we share a lot of the same heritage, and there must be something we can agree on, for sure. So we know that. And we've gone through these periods before. Personally, I think that the problems that we face now are so obvious, so clear, that the political leaders in the end are going to have to do something about them. Surveys show that the American people generally are not nearly as polarized as the politicians are. And this fact will gradually assert itself, I think.
As we get ready to vote in November, politics seems more about what team you're on than what the issues really are, which is how I got the idea for 105 conversations. I wanted to hear all sides and listen to all points of view and pass that on to my generation and beyond.
I think it isn't so much a question of can people compromise as it is, can we jointly identify what the right thing to do is? Sometimes that means a compromise of views, and sometimes it means gradually realizing, yes, this is the right point of view. I'll take what seems to be a sensitive subject, immigration. Our history is a history of a country with a huge flow of people from other countries. And that has succeeded. It has invigorated us. We've gotten lots of talent from elsewhere. The diversity has shown us how different ways of thinking can interact constructively. In a world that's diverse, we're more accustomed to diversity than anybody else because we've been living with it. So, as far as I can see, our immigration system now is broken, and it needs desperately to be fixed. And we know how to do it. We know that when somebody comes here and gets a first-class education, we don't want to send them home. We want to say, if you want to stay, you're welcome. If you want to go home, fine. We want to have an open arm to the talent of the world. And I don't mean just the sort of the high-powered brain power, but the talent that does sort of the real work. Why don't we have a decent guest worker program? If you have a guest worker program, and we've had them before, they work. People come, they do a job, and then they go home. They do that because they know they can come back in again with their guest worker when there's something to do. So they leave when there isn't anything to do. We can still honor the notion in immigration of being in favor of family unification. But at the same time, probably we have to adjust the system so there's more emphasis on the talent the immigrant brings, sort people out according to that. But at any rate, the Canadian and Australian systems do that a little bit better than we do. We could look at those, learn from them. And certainly we need to have control of who comes in so that we don't have people coming in illegally. But if we have a sensible system, there won't be the incentives to come in illegally that there are now.
So if you were currently Secretary of State, how would you lead that charge? Or what?
Well, I would be talking it up, but this is only partly a foreign policy type issue. It's mostly a domestic issue. Mm-hmm. And the leader has to be the president. I don't have at hand what Ronald Reagan said on the subject, but he was eloquent in extolling the virtues of immigration. And he said, I think it was when the Statue of Liberty was had been restored and was being lit up again as the torch in 1986, I believe it was. And they honored, part of it was honoring some immigrants who had made huge contributions to the United States, like I.M. Pei and Henry Kissinger. And he said, you can go to Japan, you'll never become Japanese. You can go to China, you'll never become Chinese. You can go to France, you'll never become a Frenchman. You can go to Germany, you'll never become a German. But anyone can come from anywhere to America and become an American.
Is there a better system allowing for less polarity and more open conversation than what we have now?
We have pretty open conversation. I don't see anybody holding back on anything. Mm-hmm. Maybe in the end we'll have some clarity. Everyone looks forward to these debates, what they will bring, who knows. What they generally show is how does a person perform under pressure. That's the main thing.
To take kind of a turn, away from politics for a second and diving into education, what does the future of education look like, and how are we going to get there?
Right now, the U.S. education system, having once been thought of as terrific, and people used to come to California because of our education system, it's lousy. We're falling behind. We're not up in the top ranks in the world in K through 12 education. We are in higher education, but not in K through 12. In California right now, Latinos, who will soon be the largest ethnic group in California, something like 43% have not been graduating from high school. Only a little better than 10% graduate from college. So that's the future labor force. And the jobs that are being produced by all these bright people around are jobs that people who haven't gotten a decent education will not be able to do. So the education system right now is causing us to have a future that's much less prosperous than it could be. And it also means that you worry about the distribution of income, but when you have a wide distribution of educational attainment, you're building that distribution of income into the system. Now, the important part is that it's quite obvious that we know how to produce absolutely sensational K through 12 education. And I don't mean only in the certain areas, like we live around here in Palo Alto and we have good education here. But if you go over to Oakland, to tough areas, you'll see an Oakland Military Institute that was created by Jerry Brown when he was mayor, It's getting the kids who have all the problems there are, and they look you in the eye, they stand up straight, they graduate from high school, they go on to college, and we can do it. We know how to do it. And the key to it is that every kid in that school has chosen to go there. Nobody told him he had to go there. It wasn't the only alternative. He chose to go there. And the people running the school know that the only reason the kids are there is because they know they're going to get a good education. So they better do a good job. And if a teacher isn't cutting the mustard, out of here. So they do like you do in any other area. You try to get people who can do the job in the job. And you're pretty relentless about it. And you're willing to look for new ways of doing things. And your object is to produce a good education for the kids. Too much of our education now is oriented to how do we see that the people who are the employees of the system do well, rather than how does the system produce a good education. So we have a lot of work to do in K through 12 education.
So if you could break it down into 3 concise steps of how we would start to fix education across the board and in California, how would you start that process?
Well, I think that K through 12 education is a good place to start. And I would underline the fact that we're now not doing a good job. Nobody should kid themselves about that. Just goes back to what I said about diplomacy. Be realistic. And then you have to look around and say, is it possible to do a better job? Yes, there are all kinds of examples. So let's get with it. People demand it. And I think for our Latino community, we owe them a decent education for their kids. And I have enough experience with them to know that it's not the kids. The kids are fine. They need an opportunity and a stimulation, which we can give.
As students are choosing to pursue advanced degrees, what would your advice be to them, as they're likely to take on a lot of debt with no guarantee of a well-paying job in order to pay off those loans?
Well, first of all, I don't think you necessarily have to borrow money in order to get through. There are lots of scholarships available. In the old days, people worked a little bit. I worked in the library when I was a student at MIT, and I didn't get paid a lot, but I got paid enough. You don't need to live at a high standard. You can get along on a can of beans or something and study. And in some ways, it's too easy to borrow money. And I'm not saying that I don't sympathize with people who run up big debts, but there are other ways to go about it. There ought to be more emphasis on giving people a chance to earn some money as they're going along.
Do you think retirement's an ideal of the past?
We have to change our attitude because people now are living longer and they're also healthier. And that means that if you have a retirement system geared to the demography of 20 years ago, and you just march along with that, pretty soon you're going to have fewer and fewer people supporting more and more people. And that, in the end, the arithmetic isn't going to work. But there's no reason why we should do that, because people are 65, they're healthy, they're able, they can work, why not? I'm almost 92 years old and I work. I don't do anything I don't want to do, but anyway, I do a lot of stuff that seems to be considered worthwhile.
In your opinion, how are jobs created and who creates them?
Well, jobs are created by private industry. People create businesses. They combine resources in such a way that the costs are not as high as the price they can charge, so they have the incentive to make a profit. and they need to employ people to do that. And over the centuries here in the United States, that's produced a bountiful number of good jobs and an economy that's been prosperous, given us all a rising standard of living.
Do you believe that we need to balance the federal budget as soon as possible, or can we chip away at it?
We seem to have gotten into the habit of consuming more than we produce. And you can't keep doing that. It means that you import. It's not a question of whether some other country is doing something, or that's just a matter of arithmetic. And if we keep spending more than we earn, we have to borrow. And we're borrowing ourselves crazy. Furthermore, going back to my concerns about my grandchildren and great-grandchildren, we're accumulating a debt that has to be serviced. And in the end, it's so large, it's going to have to get paid down in some way. And that's the future. People are going to have to contend with that. We're not doing them a favor. So I think we have to get better control of ourselves.
What would be your advice as we take on that burden?
Well, we have to adopt the policies that will give us a prosperous economy. When the economy is prospering, then you're not accumulating that kind of debt, and you can get yourself to the point where we have the budget, federal budget in balance, people are saving, and you're in a much more healthy situation. Right now, households are beginning to save again, but the federal government and the state governments are spending like crazy. They're way out of control.
As my generation takes leadership, how would you approach the Middle East?
Carefully. There is a genuine revolution taking place, and it's because there are so many young people there who have nothing to do. And we live in an information age with a revolution also in communications. So people anywhere can find out mostly what's going on. And they can communicate with each other and organize. So that's a new situation. And it is putting great pressure on patterns of governance. We have had autocratic governments. They're having a hard time because they're not used to paying attention to what's on people's minds. And then I think you need to remind yourself of what was the spark that set off this Arab rearrangement. It was a little guy in Tunisia. It was just a spark, but it was a spark. He wanted to create a little business selling fruits and vegetables. And the regime squashed him. Before he set himself on fire, he said, "Why are you doing this to me? I'm just a simple man. All I want to do is work." So in the end, these regimes will not find stability unless they can figure out how to organize themselves so that young people have something constructive to do. You have to know that work attaches you to reality. And work creates self-esteem because you're getting some resources, some money, and you deserve it because you did something. So it's a good thing.
Would we ever be able to achieve economic global stability with a nuclear Iran?
I am deeply convinced that we should be working to create the conditions for a world free of nuclear weapons, where nobody has nuclear weapons. And the worst thing that can happen is for nuclear weapons to proliferate, for new countries to get nuclear weapons, because it increases the danger that a nuclear weapon will be used by a terrorist group or in some conflict that gets out of hand. And then people will be appalled. I don't know if you ever looked at the pictures of Hiroshima after the nuclear weapon was used there. It's appalling. It's stunning. But then you have to remind yourself that at least a modern thermonuclear weapon, like the ones we have in our arsenals and advanced countries have, are much, much more powerful than the Hiroshima bomb. One of those bombs would incinerate the Bay Area, just like that. I've met with religious leaders, and they say, how is it possible that a human being should have the power to press a button and kill 1 million people? You think you're God? It's a power that should not be around, in my opinion. So I've been working hard to see if I can't help create a world free of nuclear weapons.
Have you ever used Twitter?
No, I don't walk the talk. I talk about the information age. And I wrote a book in 1962, the burden of which was, you managements are using the computer to do payrolls and personnel records. Wake up. It's going to change the way you run your company. It's going to change everything. So I've been working on this subject, but I'm not a big user. I have an iPhone and I can play music. I can do these things.
Okay. Really quickly, if you could tweet a message to my generations, I have just 140 characters. What would you tell us as a blueprint for future generations?
Hold your head up. Be optimistic. Things can work out.
Well, I really appreciate you taking the time for the interview. Thank you.